And let's see. Thank you so much for being patient as I'm kind of getting settled here. So when Amy and I first started talking about how did we want to share our experience of curating Esther, it's been a pretty organic process for the two of us. And so I thought that we might share a little bit about just kind of how that came about. And I don't remember, Amy, maybe you can fill me in, when we very first started talking about this project. I feel like it might have been last summer during the well-being show.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't started my job at that time.
Okay.
I had a couple of pieces in the well-being show, and that's when we first really met, I think. I had been hired for this job, but I hadn't started yet. And I think it was when you came by and I said I could show you the history center, and you came by and we had, well, we found out right away that we had endless things to talk about. And that for even that first time when I delivered my photos to the gallery. And then later, Sarah Jane came to the campus of the North Olympic History Center, and I showed her the Esther pieces that we had in our collection. And even in that first meeting, we did talk about how we might collaborate and how we might work together. And then I'm trying to think, maybe it was September when you came by and we went back into the rolling storage where we store our art. And I showed you what we had there. And I don't think we got to the plaid suit on that visit. I think that came a little bit later. I know
Yeah,
that.
but
Yeah.
I remember one of your volunteers mentioning that there was a plaid suit, that the plaid suit has been kind of, yes. And you know what? I'm just going to start screen sharing here.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, I heard about the plaid suit almost straight away.
let's see. So are folks seeing a plaid suit?
Yes.
Yay. I love it when technology works. And I realized as you were talking there, Amy, we have folks from the History Center and we have folks here from the Art Center. And I wonder if it would be helpful to just start out by saying this exhibit was jointly prepared by the North Olympic History Center and the Port Angeles Fine Arts Center. Amy's the executive director at the History Center. You started your job there in August,
Yeah.
I believe. So when we're talking about that timeline, and I'm the gallery and program director for the Fine Arts Center. And so there's this kind of shared history. Esther was the founder of the Art Center. She also donated a significant portion of her collection to the History Center. And so these two organizations working together to kind of bring about this show. And yes, this plaid pantsuit this belonged to Esther Webster. And so in some ways it's like the most intimate artifact, I think, in the show. If you make it into the gallery to see it, you can see where it's been very carefully let out. So she clearly wore it over a long enough period of time that she had to have it altered a couple of times. And Amy, I think in the background, do you have the skirt that goes with this suit?
I do.
So the suit was sold with both the pants and the skirt. It is abundantly clear that the pants were much more worn than the skirt. And so if that gives a little bit of a sense of who this woman is that we're talking about.
Was the suit handmade, or does it have a label in it?
It's a young Pendleton, and a little bit of internet research makes me think that it dates to the 1960s. Okay. We actually have a volunteer here who had at one time worked as a buyer for one of the department stores in Seattle, and she remembers the season of the pantsuit. And she could not pin it down to the year, but talks about the time when that became a big thing. Now, Esther had been wearing pants at least since the 1920s. So we have stories of her as a very young woman at a time when that I think would have been even more unusual. But that was something that she had been doing for quite a while. I'm going to just give a really quick overview of kind of Esther's story arc for folks who may not be super familiar with her. And I think then we can start to kind of hang some of these particular stories on that. So Esther Webster was born in 1903 in the Willamette Valley. And as a teenager, her family moved close enough to Portland that she had access to an arts high school. So she had been making art from a very, very young age, seems to have always had a strong sense of herself as a visual artist. And as a high schooler, she worked as a live-in domestic worker in order to live close enough to that arts high school so that she could get that kind of education. She did live for a few years in Portland after graduating. There are a couple stories. She did at least one semester at Reed College. It sounds like she may have dropped out because she had smallpox. That was one of the interesting little notes that kind of came bubbling up in our research that I've not seen published anywhere, but it is recorded in her journals. Also during those kind of like her early 20s in Portland, she met and went on a blind date with a guy named Charles Webster, who apparently fell asleep about 20 minutes into a Shakespeare play, and Esther was unimpressed and moved on with her life. So those two would reconnect later on and get married, but apparently he did not make a very good first impression. So at the age of 23, 1926, Esther had been dreaming of studying art in New York, and she and two girlfriends paid $50 for a Model T Ford. The story is that it had neither headlights nor a spare tire, but they drove it cross country from Portland to New York, and got what sounds like a grungy little basement apartment. And Esther took classes at the Art Students League in New York. We don't have a full list of all the classes that she would have taken. We do know that she studied with George Groth and Boardman Robinson. There are other fairly well-known artists who would have been flowing in and out of the Student League at that time. And so it's likely that she would have had contact with some of them. And I'm gonna go back. Are y'all still seeing my screen here? No. Let me try that again. Screen share. There we go. So this is one of the prints that Esther made early in her time in New York. And I think that it really captures the chaos, the busyness, the energy, the activity of the city. And what we know about a young Esther is that just was life-giving to her. She was so attracted to that and really wanted to be in the middle of that, making art, studying with people, learning, just being exposed to that level of culture. So she studied in New York. She arrived in New York in 1926. She and Charles Webster were married in September of 1929, just a few weeks before the stock market crashed. Apparently, both of them had all of their savings in stocks. And so think about this young couple starting out and literally a few weeks into their marriage, having their entire financial stability just swept out from under them. And I see that as the first in a series of setbacks, unfortunate life circumstances, things Esther would not have chosen. Esther was a woman who wanted to choose what happened and how she lived her life. And like many of us, did not always get that opportunity. So they did continue living in New York for a few more years. Charles was originally from Port Angeles. His parents had run the newspaper here in town, excuse me, which has a direct lineage to the Peninsula Daily News today. So that's a part of their legacy that continues. So in 1934, Charles got a letter from his father. His father had had a stroke and was ill. And basically, as the only son, Charles got called home to take over the family business. And so he moved back to Port Angeles in 1934. He apparently wired Esther and told her to pack and follow him. It sounds like she did not rush to do that. I don't think that this was something she wanted. And there's a little bit of a hint. So two of the books that we've really leaned on heavily are Helen Radke's Olympic Leaders. Amy, you rock, thank you. When I moved offices to find a computer that worked, apparently I've left all my props behind. So the Olympic Leaders is probably the single book that we leaned on heaviest in the research for this project. And then the second book is Straight Press, which was published just a couple years ago and follows the history of the news business here on the peninsula. And of course, because the Webster family was tied to the newspaper, there's some good research in there as well. The Olympic Leaders, though, Helen Radke makes it sound like Esther might have considered not following Charles, that might have been the end of the relationship. But unfortunately, as a married woman in the depths of the Depression, she was unable to find work. And so she had been working as an illustrator. She had been doing textile design. She had had a bit of an art career prior to that, but as a married woman, just could not find work in the Depression. And so several months later, she followed. The story is that Charles had her travel by train into Victoria and then come to Port Angeles on the ferry across the water, so that her first impression would be the town with the mountains behind it, instead of coming in through what sounds like pretty rough shanty towns that would have been out on the east side of town at that point in the Depression. One of Amy's and my favorite lines in the Olympic Leaders book is when they're trying to describe the Depression, and they say it's hard from this perspective, this modern perspective. This book was published in 2003, to imagine that time. It was a time of chaos and despair. And both of us are like, oh, we imagine that just fine. And have kind of joked about how, well, that line hasn't aged so well. We can connect with that. But it sounds like Esther had a really hard time settling into this new town where she lived. One early instance, she publicly called Port Angeles a cultural disaster, which probably not the best way to win friends and influence people. I have come in my research to hear a lot of Esther's negativity. I think that she is somebody who struggled with depression throughout her life. We certainly can identify some points where she was depressed to the point of not being very functional. But I think that unhappiness was something that she struggled with. But at the same time, Port Angeles is the place where she wound up spending 50 productive years of her life, making a career, creating her best artwork, and leaving a legacy that, 35 years after her passing, we're still living out and meeting on this technology that she could never have envisioned and talking about her story. So may all of us be that influential. Yeah, I'm going to loop over to some other pictures and do a little more screen sharing. So this is a wall in the gallery. So those of you who've managed to see the show in person will recognize this. But the bulk of this work, this is Esther painting recognizable scenes in and around Port Angeles. And it really does seem that although she was not thrilled about moving here, although she struggled to fit into the local culture, that she did find an inspiration for art making. And I read that her art making was a process by which she made peace with and found a way of connecting with this new home that she hadn't chosen. That's me projecting a little bit, but I think it's hard to make good art of something you can't stand. And so I think there's something about that process of looking, of rendering, of depicting, that ultimately to me looks like a place of connection and peace. Let's see, I'm gonna stop this screen share. During the war years, so Esther, they moved to Port Angeles in 34. By 1936, she was exhibiting regionally. She won an award for a painting that was in a show at the Seattle Art Museum in 1937. So it seems like her career as a painter took off pretty quickly in those early years. And still, I would say some of the finest work of Esther's that we have comes from kind of the late 40s through, or the late 30s through the late 40s. In 1942, she did get called, as many women did during the war, she got called to work at the newspaper. There was a manpower shortage. And so Esther apparently was initially resistant, but quickly found that she loved the media and was a good reporter. When KONP radio was launched in 1945, Esther went on the radio. She had a pseudonym of Jean Earl, which we're not quite sure why she needed a pseudonym. It seems that everybody in town was abundantly aware that that's who it was, but both on the radio and in the newspaper, her reporting was under the name of Jean Earl. And she did keep doing that after the war effort. So she stayed on the radio for a while, and then in the mid-50s, her husband Charles had 2 strokes that left his health in poor condition. And it seems that she became pretty heavily involved in the paper, basically kind of making up for what he was unable to do. And so she remained involved in the media until after Charles's death in the early 70s when she sold the paper. But so she had a 30-year media career as well. And not as many paintings that were done. It seems like she was painting kind of up until Charles became ill. And then from kind of the mid-50s, Charles passed, and I don't know if it was 68 or 69, but Charles passed in the late 60s. Esther sank into a pretty deep depression after that, which resulted in the sale of the paper. And then there were a few more years after that before her painting really picked up again. And then kind of the mid 70s into the early 80s, she had another little renaissance in her career and was quite productive. And her style had changed a fair bit at that point, but she was clearly making a lot of art and enjoying it and very involved in the local art scene. So she was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 1979. She opted not to do treatment. She also told very few people about the diagnosis, but she did almost immediately start making plans for how her estate could become some kind of an art center. And one of the really fascinating things that we turned up in researching this is that I had always assumed, Esther is a painter, she's a visual artist, so of course she's gonna, want to start a visual arts place. Well, in fact, she had been on the board of the symphony. She had been heavily involved with the community players. The Webster family donated the land where the community playhouse is located. And so if you look at the map of our property, they just tuck right into the park. And it seems that her decision to found a visual arts space was in recognizing that that was a gap here in Port Angeles that she wanted to fill, and that she felt that the performing arts were in fact quite strong. but that the visual arts needed a venue. And so it's been neat to also see how the Fine Art Center, the work of the Fine Art Center really is intended to integrate with this bigger cultural artistic story here in Port Angeles. So I've come away with a different sense of almost like what our mission is as an organization, as a result of understanding a little bit more about our founder. So I have dominated this a lot, and I would love to hand off to Amy and see, in your experience, your side of the research, if there are things that really stood out that you'd like to build on anywhere in that story.
Yeah, it was such a privilege really to contribute to this show and to call on the research of the History Center. One of the pieces that came fairly late in the research were the obituaries of Charles and Esther, and our family researcher, Susan Bertal, located those. And true to the newspaper man's life, Charles is just full of facts and dates and titles and places. It's real interesting. Esther's is, I mean, because he died quite a bit earlier and had living relatives and people who knew all these facts, they were able to fill in all those details in his obituary. Hers, I would say, is more of an artist's obituary. It's more emotional. It has more personal details. And of course, the longer you live, I suppose, the fewer people you have nearby who would write an obituary and know all these facts and dates and details about you. But they're both very, very interesting. We had discovered that most of the Webster family was buried in Ocean View Cemetery, but we just weren't coming up with what had happened to Esther and Charles. We did not find any evidence of burial. I believe it was his obituary that said he was cremated, and it appears that she probably was too, but those gave us a lot of information. And like I said, those came pretty close to opening. And were such a welcome piece of information. And it was also just a pleasure for us to be able to work together and fill in some of those details. I don't know if the Fine Arts Center had the obituaries. They weren't on hand, I don't think so. That was nice to be able to locate those. And it also gave us a lot of information about the two of them. I knew we had Esther art hanging, and when I was on my final interview for this job and got to take a tour of our, we call it the archive storage facility. I mean, Esther has been someone I have been fascinated with since I was a teenager. And that was my favorite part of the interview, was seeing those paintings hanging in the back of this building. And then I located other artifacts, including the Sunset magazine from 1951, I believe it is, that is in the exhibit. The same photos from that photo shoot are in the, you know, how Sunset publishes these books on decks and patios and children's furniture. And one of those books was it Western Homes, Sarah Jane? I can't remember.
It's something like New Homes for Western Living, but it's one of those kind of like lovely little books that would give you inspiration. And so it's clear that this house had a spread in both the regular publication of the magazine and in this book. Interestingly, somehow the History Center got the magazine and the Art Center had a copy of the book. We're like, who knows how these artifacts have wandered around.
And they share the photos are the same in both. So if you go to the exhibit, you'll see the cover of the Sunset magazine, and then the book is open to those same photos. So just so you know, it is the same photos, but it's fun to see that Sunset magazine from so long ago. And of course, that house was a real showpiece. having an architect designed home, and we can get into that later. Sarah Jane said yesterday that I found the squishy parts of Esther and connected with her on a lot of things, and also just have sort of speculated about how people might have viewed her, how she viewed the town, and how building a house, building an architect designed house on a hill like that, especially at that time when I think the Crest Haven neighborhood that sits below the college had not yet been built, and just how people might have thought about her or looked at that, and her view that's so expansive from up there. I mean, clearly there's a tenuous relationship perhaps between the community and Esther. And for some reason, I thought the architecture or the placement of that home might have had something to do with that. But I am fascinated with her arc. It was very fun to explore that. Like we said, the book Olympic Leaders gave us so much history, and really this book connected our two organizations. I found out things about the History Center that I did not know through this book. I did not know that the Visitor Center, the Olympic National Park Visitor Center, was originally a joint project of the National Park and the History Center. It was called the Clallam County Historical Society at the time. And eventually the park decided they wanted to have that building to themselves. And it sent the History Center out, eventually landing at the courthouse, and then later settled monetarily with the History Center, which enabled us to buy this campus that I'm on today with the historic Lincoln School and the two buildings, the library and the archives that we work out of. So to find that our two organizations had a long history, and that Esther obviously created the legacy of the Port Angeles Fine Arts Center, but that she had a real interest in the History Center too, that she had a great sense of history. She had a great sense of story. And in many ways, I think curated her own story along the way. And one of those, as Sarah Jane described, one of the values of the pieces that the History Center holds is that they are self-curated. Esther chose those pieces for the History Center herself. And so it was wonderful to have her sort of posthumously, in a way, participating in the show. We knew that those were pieces that she wanted, I suppose, on view. I think that's safe to say. It was an honor and a privilege to keep her alive. I mean, I think that's what any of us want in the end, maybe, is that someone will tell our story, value our life, talk about us. We talked and talked about her. And I wish I had brought this quote that I saw recently, but it talked about how the past is not fixed. It's colorful and it changes because we redefine it. We can't help but see the past through the present. And like, for example, what Sarah Jane mentioned with the pandemic, comparing that to the depression or the despair that people were feeling at some of those times during Esther's early life. Let's see, what else are we?
I don't know. You want me to take over for a sec?
Sure. Well, one more thing. I am, and this is me projecting too. I wrote down place as subject as you were talking, Sarah, about the subject of her paintings. Here she is, newly arrived, that gallery wall that you saw. You'll see, if we look back at it, that two of the paintings are actually of the paper mill. And I have some theories about why in the earliest days of her arrival, she might have been interested in that. If you see the two paintings on the left, the top one is of the paper mill, and the one below it is the same scene, but done in a different style, more colorful, more abstract. The upper painting is grittier. I know I have the feeling when I'm driving through the paper mill that it feels like a small city. It's very urban, it's very gritty, it's very industrial. And I know, I mean, I'm quite sure because of Esther's love for the urban life that the built environment is a source of fascination for her. And I'm not surprised. I was saying to Sarah Jane just yesterday, I imagine New York City in the 20s was probably a pretty gritty place. There was probably air pollution. And so maybe depicting the paper mill like that was, you know, her sort of seeking out maybe a piece of that, of that sort of aesthetic. I did not notice, I was standing there in front of those when Sarah Jane said, did you notice that these are the same scene? And I had not noticed that. And I think it's quite fascinating. In the upper photo, I had not noticed the figures until I looked at the bottom photo. The figures in the foreground, they remind me of Hammering Man outside of the Seattle Art Museum, just that very industrial kind of working class figure. And I think it's real fascinating that she struggling with place and with this, you know, we all struggle with those start overs in life that we didn't invite. And here she is in a place that she didn't necessarily choose, but most of the subject matter of her paintings is of place. And it could have been of anything. It could have been flowers, it could have been abstract, which of course she did go into, but I do think it's interesting that she worked out perhaps her feelings about it through painting.
I'm so glad that you brought this this pair of paintings up, Amy. And you will notice that I had come prepared with a separate photo of these two specifically.
Thank you. I didn't mean to speak
yeah.
for you because that's
no, it's perfect. Well, and I want to acknowledge I had been in the gallery with these paintings on a daily basis, moving them around, deciding what was going to go where. They were hanging on the wall before I realized that these two are depicting the same scene. And they're painted just a year apart. So that top kind of gritty dark painting is 1936 and the bottom one is 1937. So you're not looking at how her style changed. You're looking at the breadth of approaches that she was using to paint what she was seeing here, which is pretty cool, I think.
I feel like the bottom one is I mean, it's more colorful, it's a little happier, it's a little brighter. I wonder how that first year was for her and if that speaks to that at all. We, of course, a lot of our conversations, Sarah Jane and I, were about the arc of women's lives, and we experienced our own things while we were preparing for this show, and it is hard not to notice some things about Esther's life. For example, the moving somewhere for love, such a common theme, such a common theme in women's lives.
Well, and needing to follow a husband's career, you know, I mean, that's a reality that plenty of women live with now as well. Yeah. I'm going to take that as a perfect point to pivot to something that is relevant. This is one of my favorite artifacts in the show. And if you're thinking this looks backwards, that's because you're looking at a print block. We don't have a print that she made from this. You have to picture the image being in reverse. But this was from a Christmas card that Esther, it looks like through the 40s and maybe early 50s, that she was designing little holiday cards or maybe New Year's each year. So this is her depiction of Esther and Charles. And there are several things that I noticed. Are you able to see when I wiggle my cursor around here? Is that showing up? So first of all, I'd like to note that she's wearing pants and they're wearing matching ski outfits, which might be the cutest thing ever. Amy also managed to find this fabulous pair of vintage 1930s skis from the History Centers. I think it even came from the rummage sale collection. But we were able to try to re-envision what those big, heavy wooden skis would have been like. But you'll notice they're skiing down the mountain, but under them is the mill. And so there's a sense of the recreation and the industry and the natural world of Port Angeles. So again, this idea of placemaking. You can put anything on a holiday card. You can depict yourself and your spouse in any setting, any way. And yet she's grabbing all of this local scenery. And then at the bottom, I love that she lists them as Esther and Charles Webster. And I am of a generation where I am not used to being called Mrs. my husband's name, but Esther certainly was a generation where she would have been known socially as Mrs. Charles Webster. And I think the fact that she put herself first, put herself in pants, put herself flying down this mountain, just says a lot about who she was. And I think the fact that she and Charles had a long, apparently loving, fruitful partnership together also says a lot about who he was as a man, to be willing to and able to partner with a woman who was so unconventional in the way that she moved through the world. So as somebody who kind of is just not good at gender roles, I hardcore relate to Esther and delighted in this part of her story, and have really, really found a point of connection with just the sense of freedom that she clearly had in doing what she wanted to do instead of what the people around her would have expected.
Yes, and so here she comes to his hometown. She does something right away to shock his parents, and it has to do with clothing. Maybe you can remind me of the outfit that his mother invited her to something, and she showed up in something that was not traditional.
It was like bobby socks and open-toed shoes and some little jaunty hat and no gloves. And that to me, in 2021 sounds like a totally acceptable outfit, but apparently in 1930s Port Angeles, it was a scandal. And so that memory has flowed down through the oral history of Port Angeles,
yes.
Which I think says something about what a significant incident it was.
And you'll see, as in their shirts here, the plaids and the checks are ubiquitous. We see a lot of the photos that that Sarah Jane found of Esther. She's wearing checks and plaids well into her life. She is wearing them, I think, there's a photo of her in the Esther Webster gallery when it was still her home. Or is she coming out the door? Maybe those are in the sunset photos.
There's one of the sunset photos where she's peeking out from behind a wall. And I tell you what, I didn't prepare that one in my photos, but I bet I can find it if you give me just a second. So
Sarah Jane found a photo of her sketching, I believe it was, up at Hurricane Ridge at one of the overlooks that, was it Gunnar Fagerland?
Fagerland.
Okay. And she was wearing checked or plaid pants in that one. It just repeats, that's a repeating theme. I even thought that I saw it in the floor. We can get to this later, but there's a abstract painting of her dining room, I think it is, at their Caroline Street house. And the floor really pops. And to me, it also looked like checks or plaids, but I might have been seeing through that lens. And then while you look for that, Sarah Jane, I pulled out our Esther boxes this morning. One thing that just keeps happening is new discoveries. So, hopefully this show tells a story, but also sets up for another story. Hopefully it's a little bit of a cliffhanger, and we'll continue discovering and bringing new things. I found this letter dated February 5th, 1949. It's from Esther to someone named Ivy, and I'm not sure who Ivy is, but it talks about skiing. She said, every day for weeks I've thought of you in this letter, but so many times demanding events have crowded in that one delay follows another. Now I'm waiting for my ride to the high country where we go each weekend to ski. So few people are taking advantage of our superb mountain slopes this winter that we are threatened with closure of the road and also the lodge. With this threat in the background, I've been writing long stories about skiing at Deer Park, ski lessons, who skis, and the like. I love that. Of course, this all means that I have to be there myself each weekend, but as I love the high mountain slopes, 5,000 feet, and enjoy the simple brand of skiing I do, it is a rather nice assignment, but time consuming. And she goes on a little bit, but another new discovery just this morning.
That's fabulous. Well, and I have, it's not going to be a great image because it's the whole side gallery here. But we do have here in the back of the gallery, I mentioned the skis, and then we have a couple different paintings that she had done of the local ski scene. It sounds like Deer Park was kind of the place that she spent a lot of time. But yeah, it's clear that recreation was a significant part of how she was able to connect with and enjoy the place. And what Amy said about the sort of ongoing discoveries has definitely been the experience of working on this show. I had a conversation with somebody in like late January, just a couple of weeks before we were set to open, and they asked, well, how's it going? And I said, well, I feel like we're sort of like skipping through a meadow of wildflowers and we keep gathering awesome things, but I have no idea how we're going to shove them all into this vase. And it really, it felt like we were curating up to the very last minute, and then things keep turning up. So one really fun thing that's happened on this end, we got contacted by the daughter of a friend of Esther's named Grace Charnel, and folks who are involved in theater around here may recognize Grace's name because she was heavily involved in the Port Angeles Community Players. And apparently Grace and Esther were dear friends. Grace was a painter in addition to a thespian. And it appears that there's a collection of Grace's paintings influenced by Esther that may be forthcoming. So it's neat to see even how her little connections to other people in the community and her influence. And certainly we know that she taught art classes and was influential in supporting other artists in town. But neat to see some of that start bubbling up again as well. I'm curious because I feel like Amy and I have been talking, and that's like legit how this entire project has come together. But I'm curious if there are questions from the audience, or if there are things that we've kind of glossed over that you'd like us to dig into deeper.
Yeah, I have a question about the two paper mill paintings. Mm-hmm. I saw this blue arc in the lower one, the later one, and it and this is my projecting, I guess, but it felt like the curvature of the earth, and it gave me a different sense of place, like a perspective that I thought was interesting.
I wonder if it's not supposed to be.
I just wondered if you saw that or.
I have looked at that arc and noticed it and thought, is that her? Is this arc her interpreting a horizon line. One thing that I find very interesting between these two photos is that things that are very solid in her more naturalistic depiction. So for example, these I want to call them canisters because I don't speak paper mill. These storage containers down here that then become translucent in the abstracted version, while the shadow from them becomes this like huge aggressive thing. And so I think that is as good an interpretation, Diane, as I have of what you're seeing there. And I think that it is at least probable that Esther would agree with that interpretation of what's happening. I certainly do not think Esther would be an artist who would get bent out of shape if we misinterpreted her work or saw things that she didn't intend, though.
Sarah, do you think that the first photo, the upper one, is something that she maybe sketched in place, and that I just have this sense that the lower photo is that she used the upper photo as her model, and that the upper photo she used that little place as
Not real well.
model.
I think that's quite possible. We have in the display case that's right next to this in the gallery, we actually have her little sketchbook, and we have some of her original sketches and color mixing notes for that top image. Some of the other images that are similarly abstract to that bottom image, we have sets of sketches that show the process by which she got to that abstraction. I did not find the sketches for this particular one. On the other hand, the amount of work in the show is maybe 1/10 of the amount of work that we had to choose from. And I have to be honest that there were points where I flipped through a sketchbook and thought, okay, I have to move on. So there's a lot of material there. My impression of Esther's approach to abstraction is that she was very methodical about it. And so where some artists, especially more contemporary artists, might have a looser, more intuitive approach, I think Esther planned things out pretty carefully in these early paintings. But it would not at all surprise me, since she had already just the previous year painted that scene and done a lot of preparation and taken a lot of notes. It seems very reasonable to think that she could have taken that material into her studio, and that this other piece would have been more of a studio piece.
I wonder if that line could be Edith's Hook or Victoria, or the Vancouver Island. I don't know. I mean, it could be. It's not something I notice. I appreciate Diane bringing our attention to it. That I love the arc, or the curve of the earth, because it's like it's place making on a much grander scale, if to think of it that way.
Yeah, and I think that is an interpretation that I will hold on to and share with other people, because there's something about it that it's like it feels evocative, and that's what art is supposed to do. And I think especially abstract art, the amazing thing about it is that it invites us in to do our own interpretation. And so instead of the artist giving us this thing and saying, this is how it is, which that top painting is pretty, this is how it is. But the bottom one invites a little bit more interaction and thought, yeah.
It takes me back to the dining room abstract of the Caroline Street house that they lived in before they built the house on Beaver Hill. They lived in a more traditional house on Caroline Street, at the end of Caroline Street on the bluff. And Sarah Jane has hung that photo with 5 studies that Esther created, very linear studies of that room before she painted it. And one thing that struck me about that photo, and that I think strikes probably all of us about Port Angeles is the blues, the blue out the window, especially over the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And if you're a newcomer, I mean, we're probably used to it by now, the people that live here, but especially in that photo with all of its reds and yellows, the blue out the window is profound. And I think of that blue in the beyond of the lower paper mill painting too, and that blue arc that Diane pointed out.
And I'm desperately looking to see if I have a picture of that, and I have a picture of like everything else.
Your mom is raising her hand. I'm sorry, I shouldn't bring up things and not without warning.
I'm curious, with those two different styles of painting of the paper mill, is that something she would have studied in her time of art? I mean, were those both established? And I guess related to that then is there art that moved past what her training was in and yeah, that developed over her lifetime?
We'll leave it to my own mother to ask me that kind of question. I didn't even plant that one. Let's see. So I'm going to bring it. I'm sorry. I'm trying to screen share and find things at the same time, and I'm apparently bad at that. So coming back to these two, definitely both of these stylistically to me look like things that she would have studied in New York in that kind of late 20s, early 30s. This is a point when Cubism is big. This is a point when the Ashcan school is at work. So I think in these, certainly I see Esther's particular style. They read as Esther Webster's work to me, but I think that they would be reflective of something she learned there. I'm gonna share. This is one of the pieces that didn't make it into the final exhibit, and I don't have a date on this. We have lots and lots of sketches that Esther, she very much liked to use hotel stationery. I am watching people be able to read the title at the bottom. If you're unable to read Esther's handwriting, it says, "In defense of going to sleep in front of TV."
Oh.
This to me looks like Esther experimenting. It's not that it is, not that it is necessarily groundbreaking work, but certainly later in her life when she was working in retirement and I think probably felt less pressure to conform to expectations of the art world or compete or anything like that. She was very experimental, and she did a lot of work with things like magic markers that were newly available, and also really playing with these kind of abstract, geometric, layered, translucent forms. We have some other really lovely abstract work in the show that I think comes from this same time period. So that's where I would see her being a little bit more experimental, but I wouldn't say that she's necessarily, I think she's more just kind of noodling. Like it reminds me of how musicians will just sit down at the piano and mess around and see what comes out. And I think that she may have been doing that earlier in her career, and those sketches may not have been saved. Certainly we have more work from later in her career because it's more recent. But I think that's where I really see her curious, experimental, questing kind of spirit coming out. Yeah.
It's interesting that it's from Portland. I assume TV was maybe black and white at the time. And it made me think of her love for, is it avant-garde jazz or?
Yes.
There's something, seems like there's a little bit of a connection there, that she appreciated improvisation maybe and playfulness and experimentation in art.
I think recognize that that is an essential part of creativity, equally as much as the skills and techniques and, you know, grounding in the tradition of the work that you're doing. She was always interested in what was new, what was cutting edge, where were people breaking ground on anything. She was just very hungry for that throughout her life, it seems.
I was thinking about your mother's question about her influence and her art training. And I did, when I looked into George Gross, one of her professors at, what is the school called, Sarah Jane?
Oh, it's the Art Students League.
Art Students League, that some of the prints and sketches that we've seen, the one where she is, she's depicted something in New York with the map of the world in the background. That is, there is some similarity between her work here in her earlier years, and I thought I could see an influence between her work and the work of her art professor George Gross. I think it's Grosz. I didn't see as much, and Sarah Jane's the artist here, with Boardman Robinson, as I did with George Gross. But it was fun to go down that rabbit hole and see how she might have been influenced by those two professors.
Yeah, well, and I would say, when I think about the artists who've influenced my work, I don't know if you looked at their work and looked at my work that it would necessarily, that the influence would be visible. So I think, you know, sometimes it's like, oh yes, that is a style, I wish to adopt that, and then my work will look like my teachers. But I think there are times where it's like every artist also has their own inner vision that they're working with. And so you can be heavily influenced by somebody, and yet the way that that flows out can look really different.
That is true. And maybe closer to her schooling years, that might be more evident, and certainly not nearly as much as you move away. And also, I just observed that again with that blue arc that Diane brought up, this world in the background, again, sort of harkens back to that idea. I mean, maybe there's a parallel there, that if that is a curvature of the earth, this depiction of the globe in the background of this photo is sort of interesting.
Yeah. Well, and it certainly, so this piece predates that piece that Diane was talking about. And this gives us, here is a clear depiction of Esther making place and sticking the earth in the background in that same spot. If I were writing an academic paper and trying to back up the idea that that arc in the mill painting is the curvature of the earth, this would be what I would build that case on, because it's clear that she's got a history of doing that. I'd like to circle back to, oh, give me a second. It's going to take me a minute to find this. I'd like to circle back to that wall that has all of the local art on it. Well, not all of the local art. The wall of the work that Esther thought was locally significant. It's been really fun. I get the fun side of this, that because I work on site here at the gallery, I frequently get to meet people and see how they're moving through the space and interacting with the exhibit. And it's been really neat to watch people interact with this. I had somebody yesterday, we were talking, this big middle painting is, for folks who know Port Angeles, it is just like full of mystery, because it has enough recognizable imagery in it that we're quite, it's like, you know what you're looking at, but I'm pretty sure that Esther has compressed a couple of different scenes and kind of collaged some imagery together. And so it's fun to watch people kind of look at it and sort of like struggle to reconcile what we know and what we're seeing and how do these things fit together and what might have changed and what might not have changed. But I had the loveliest experience yesterday. Somebody was just looking at it and talking about it, and she said, "Oh, that thing up there in that top left corner. Does anybody here know what that might be?" This little towery thing. So apparently that is Port Angelis's only air raid siren. And it was loud enough that it could be heard all the way across the town. And the woman that told me this was born in 1938, so she was a little girl at the time, but she says she remembered her mother, the siren going off, them blacking out the windows, covering everything up, and her mother putting her to bed by flashlight. And so just realizing during the war years how vulnerable Port Angeles must have felt because of this location here on the strait. And then thinking that, wow, here's somebody who was a little kid at the point that that was happening, and yet it made such an impression on her that she saw that painting and immediately was able to connect that. Another thing that I find really fun about this wall, so the 5 paintings on the left-hand side were all done relatively early in Esther's time here in Port Angeles. I think this small one down bottom middle right, I guess that would be, that is from 1950. All of the other left-hand side ones are earlier than that. And then these 2 paintings on the right are very late. This is this top one that depicts the reflection of a tree on a lake. It's 1983. That's the latest piece in the show. Esther passed in January of 85. So this would have been nearing the end of her life. And this little one under it, I believe, is 81 or 82. So similarly, late in her career. I find it striking between this painting of Salt Creek and this painting, which she has titled Blue Night with Lights, I believe is the title of that piece. Completely different scene. One is rural, one is more urban. One is daytime, one is night. It's the same composition. So 30 years apart, she is attracted to that horizontal and repeating vertical lines. I was just really struck by the ways that those, I think of those as like the really core things of our identity as artists that just, they come bubbling up and we don't even necessarily know about them. So that composition to me is it's a very Esther Webster composition. And then I do find it interesting that this her latest piece is not wildly different from her nature depictions from much earlier in her life. So you really see a little bit of an arc there.
I really appreciate you pointing that out. I had not seen that until I was in the gallery and you mentioned that they're the same composition. And if I could, I did find 2 artifacts this morning.
Ooh.
Again, so typical of this, of curating this show, to keep making discoveries. And it goes back to the air raid siren. It appears to be a letter to a family member. It is not dated. And it starts with, "You asked me what I'd like of your old things," and it is difficult to say. And then she lists a few things. The second paragraph, and again, this actually seems to be part of a letter and maybe not the whole thing, but there's this paragraph. Since you mentioned the siren, she said, "Well, the guns are beginning to blast away again. When they shake the house as they are now, we cannot quite help wondering if this is it, though we know it can't be, or sirens would blow and the like. I have to go and report a school board meeting, a dull and awful job, only pleasant compared to having to write it up afterwards. Now, I get a good many of the bad jobs, such as governmental meetings, boards, and commissions. Now and then it's fun, and now and then very unpleasant when they don't like what you write, as they are all surely not to sooner or later. So that's a fun just piece of a letter that I found this morning in our archives. I couldn't help it. I wasn't planning on sharing that, but when you mentioned the air raid siren.
I love it. And now I'm like, what else are you hiding back there? To be clear, everything that I've brought up, Amy already knew about. A lot of what Amy's bringing up, I didn't know about because it's happened so recently that we've not had a chance to talk about it yet.
We spoke yesterday, and then today I was like, maybe I'll just take one more little tour through. And there's a lot. We have many sketches, and we do have papers and letters, and some of the Jean Earl work, her pseudonym. There's a piece in the show. It's a bound kind of a tablet that contains writings that she did. She toured Europe and went all across the United States, I believe, by train, and then on to Europe and back for 3 months or something like that. And she used that pseudonym Jean Earl, and we found this kind of bound tablet, I would call it, of her work called Let's Travel. And I found this was in a box with mostly those drafts all typed out like this. So I don't know if you can see her signature at the bottom. It says Esther of this one, and they all look kind of like this, typed on onion skin. There's lots of crossing things out, and like with here, the word governmental, it's got a space, and she makes some proofreader's marks. So it's fun to see those kinds of things.
It is neat that a lot of the documents that we have been hand marked in some way. One of the really interesting discoveries that I made we have I don't know, a week before the show opened, I was digging in a closet here on site, and I found an old laptop box that had a piece of masking tape on it that said Webster Historic Papers. And I thought, oh, that might be relevant. Didn't know we had that. And so I opened it up, and it is her correspondence dating from the late 40s through the end of her life. It's been curated in a way. I mean, clearly this is not every letter that she ever received. But one of the things that turned up in that was a series of letters that both Esther and Charles had written to a number of museums and cultural institutions on the West Coast. And I only had like the drafts of their letters, which of course had all the markings, and then occasionally the responses that they were getting, and it was sort of not everything is dated, and it was tricky to figure out. But what I was able to piece together is that Esther had, in 1941, Esther had a solo show at the Seattle Art Museum that was picked up by the West Coast Museum Directors Alliance, which was an organization. Diane is nodding, and she actually might know if this organization still exists. At that time, they were moving art between the major metropolitan museums on the West Coast. And so Esther's work made it at least to Spokane and San Francisco. And then the war shut everything down. The gallery in Spokane where her work had been exhibited, the art center was completely taken over as some kind of a military institution. And Esther and Charles had no idea where 3 crates of her paintings were, because they were supposed to be traveling among these museums. And right about the time they started traveling, everything shut down from the war. And so we have almost 2 years worth of Esther and Charles writing to different people and saying, when was the last time you saw this? Where did you ship it to? What is the address and contact person at the next location? At one point, Charles reached out to friends who lived in Spokane to be like, why can we not get a hold of anybody at the Spokane Art Center? And they physically went, and they said, well, it's because it's being used as some kind of war thing. And there is no art center there. And so what ended up happening was apparently the work had made it back to the basement of the Seattle Art Museum, and enough of the SAM employees were off doing things with the war effort that nobody knew where to look for the crates. And so her work had been safe this whole time, but she's writing and writing and writing and asking and having people say, well, we shipped it to Spokane, 11 months ago, but we haven't heard anything. And just really interesting to think about what it would be as an artist to have, this had to have been her best and most important work at that point in her life. It was in a solo show at the SAM, and then to just have it evaporate. So we know that some of those paintings made it into the show that we have now, because many of the paintings that are in the show have the original museum tags on the back from other places that they've been exhibited. So we have some records of that. But it was just an interesting sort of little window into a part of her experience in a way that her art career was really disrupted by the war effort and what was happening with that. Yeah. I'm waiting for somebody to either ask a question or Amy to say something. Oh, I see a Janice Noonan.
Um,
Oh, I think I tried to unmute you at the same time that you were unmuting you.
Okay.
She's back.
Okay. I just want to make three small comments. The industrial art. It reminds me, you were talking and you weren't sure, you thought perhaps this was someplace that reminded her of New York in a good way or a bad way. And someone brought up the paper mill on part of, well, we were talking about the paper mill. And I must say that as a young 16-year-old, I used to pick my father up at a place called the Port Dock in Grays Harbor, which is where he worked as a longshoreman. And in those days, you were allowed to drive down on the dock, and you would sit there and wait for the ship coming in, or the men would quit working and he would just get in the car and away we would go. Of course, now that is all totally different and very, very secure from a long way off. But when I drive through that paper mill, I get a comfort from it. Yeah. And I know that is what it is. It's the industrial piece of it, which is, I know that's where it comes from, is that same thing. It's not a negative thing. It's a very positive thing. The other thing is, when I look at pictures of Esther Webster, I think of Katharine Hepburn. And Katharine Hepburn introduced the pants to the world in the 1930s. She was a really, truly individual woman, and you didn't see too many others. And I just wonder if she was trying to emulate that lovely woman in her slacks as being independent and outspoken and what have you. The third thing I want to say is that the Performing Arts High School in Portland, Oregon is Jefferson High School. And it's been in operation since 1908, both fine and performing arts. So I have to assume that that is where Esther went to school. It might be worth finding out if they have any information on Esther as well.
Janice, that's so interesting that you brought up Katharine Hepburn, and Janice reminds me of Katharine Hepburn. Especially like when you wear a long sleeve shirt under a denim button up, and just that way with clothes and just that elegance and that sort of thing. And on page 9 of Olympic Leaders, and Katharine Hepburn actually appears in the index on pages 9 and 91. It says, tall and slender, Esther carried herself with dash and assurance. Later, because of her confident stride and her practice of wearing trousers at a time when that was considered daring, some people would compare her to Katharine Hepburn. Women were free spirits, unwilling to be bound by convention. Esther felt a kinship with the actress, and once in her diary referred to Hepburn as my sister.
Nice sketch.
So
yeah.
Well, there weren't too many people doing that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's in that same section in the Olympic Leader. There is a mention of her wearing trousers in the 1920s and being compared to Amelia Earhart. So again, that kind of, I mean, these are women who were just really groundbreaking at that time.
Good
Yes, it
comparison.
goes beyond that. I mean, some of the later pictures of her look like Katharine Hepburn in On Golden Pond, maybe with her hair up and
Yeah.
and the kind of casual elegance of the clothing. Earhart is not listed in the index, but I do recall reading that. I'm just not sure where it is in the book.
Well, and it's an interesting thing. I feel like on the one hand, I'm so familiar with that book, and on the other hand, there are times where I'm like, I swear I have read this line and I can almost cite it word for word, and yet I can't pin down where it is.
Yeah, same here. There's again just new discoveries constantly and new ways of seeing her life, including through this book. Like I looked in the index and there's Grace Charnell. I had not noticed that when we were doing original research. So that'll be a fun, one thing I love about biographies, as I told Grace Charnell's daughter, because she submitted a research request to our organization. You read one biography and then you become fascinated with the other people mentioned in it. And it's fun to keep chasing down those lives and stories.
Well, and I feel like that's been like such a delight for me. This is the first time I've curated a show of work by an artist who's not living. And so I'm very used to having the artist to go to when I have questions about things or whatever. And Amy, it has just been such a delight to research with you and get to kind of explore and discover the history with you. And I am so grateful for just there are resources that you've thought to look for that I'm not used to thinking about because I'm not used to looking into history in quite the same way. And so it's just been a really, I hope that it comes through in the finished exhibit, how much fun we had doing this, and the fact that like, I think we both suspected that we were going to be friends before we started working on this project, but like, we're hardcore friends now, and it just has been like this amazing gift to get to do this, and a gift to get to share it with you. And part of the pandemic experience that's been so odd is, I mean, most of our research was happening via Zoom, and we haven't had a lot of time to spend together in a space. And so I think in some ways this is the largest group that we've had a chance to just interact and share with.
I'm so glad you brought that up. What a wonderful way to start a friendship.
We recommend it.
Discussions about our lives, discussions about Esther's lives, where we see those overlaps, discussions about our organizations, to be able to bring these different perspectives to the show. So much research, so much conversation went into it. And then of course, in the final product, there's an editing, I mean, the curating happens. And yet I think, and it's hard for me to say and be objective, but I do think all that went into it, I hope that when you go into the gallery, or if you've been there, that you feel all that background, all that conversation that went on. There's so much that isn't necessarily written or depicted in the show, but I think it's present in the show. And I think Sarah Jane has just done a beautiful job of putting it together. The title of the show, Creating a Scene, is not a double entendre or a triple entendre. It goes beyond that. It speaks to Esther maybe creating a little good trouble, but also creating scenes in her art, in her affiliation with the Playhouse, and in other ways. And the show is actually set up in scenes too. And Sarah Jane used the word vignette, and you'll see that it's shown in 5 vignettes. And I just think that's brilliant. It's really been the privilege of my life to participate in this. It's really beyond my wildest dreams. I love it.
And I think that you're going to see more from the two of us in the future, if only because we can't seem to stop, so we may as well share it publicly. It's been really cool to see the way that things have continued unfolding. And I think at the point that we realized, like, oh dear, we are not going to finish this project by that February 13th opening date, but instead we're going to let this project be the first and then see what can flow out from that. So yeah.
You might have seen in the paper that Sarah Jane, in the article that the press release that Port Angeles Fine Arts Center submitted, there has not been a show like this on Esther since, I think, 2004, is it? Mm-hmm. I just thought that they were just putting on Esther shows all the time. And and Sarah Jane had mentioned that to me repeatedly during the lead up, and it just wasn't landing with me until I really read it in print, and it was just wonderful to be able to do that and to call upon our various collections and bring them together this way.
Yeah, well, and I think it's I'm old enough that 2004 doesn't sound that long ago, and yet you think about how many people have grown up, have moved here since then, and so have never had access to this story. And I really see it as it is a historic story, but because of Esther's forward-thinking vision in founding the Art Center, in investing in this larger art scene, I mean, she continues creating a scene even decades after her passing. And so there's a real sense of also like, what is the forward motion? And I'm very curious about who are the Esther Websters who are living among us right now, and who are visioning and building for what's coming next. So
I'm struck by the energy of her life and what that has to say, maybe particularly to women, but I also think just in this time of pandemic and of facing stuff that is not chosen, and it seems like there's just real power in all of this. Yeah,
and that you may be hearing that for two reasons. I do think that Esther's story has a lot of that to give. I also think the reality is this is a show that was curated by two women living through a pandemic. And so we didn't get to pick what we were relating to of Esther's story, There just were parts of it that felt very, very real and relatable to us. Yeah. Well, we're nearing up on that 11:30 mark, and I, as somebody who doesn't do well on Zoom, I feel really protective of people who might be maxing out. So if you're feeling like this has been enough, you're full up, your inspiration tank is overflowing, and you're ready to get on with your day, please feel free to wander out. And if you'd like to stick around, we'll be sticking around. So thank you so much for being here. This is a pleasure. It really is.
I noticed Diane wrote in the chat, I wonder if the Cascadia Museum in Edmonds would love to learn about this collection and exhibit.
And Diane brought that up with me just a couple days ago, and I have not had a chance to reach out to them yet, but I am going to see if we can get somebody from there to here while the exhibit is still open, because I think Esther Webster would be right in line with the kind of work that they're showing, and we know that her work has not been shown since they've been open. So.
What are you saying?
I want to say to you guys that Janice and I took one of those offers and had a cup of tea in the gallery and just sat there and absorbed for an hour and a half or so. And Sarah hosted us so well. My attitude coming on here today was, wow, we really saw it. What could this possibly add? And the answer is a lot. So Thank you guys very much for doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a real compliment.
Mhm. Yes, it
You've
is.
given it a third dimension.
Yep.
You really have.
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh,
Patrick is on the board. Patrick's the vice president of the board of directors of the North Olympic History Center, and Janice is a volunteer in the research library. And they're so supportive of our work.
You know, I was introduced to Esther Webster when I began working in the archives with Kathy Estes, who was the former executive director. And what had happened was we'd had a fashion show. And I think it might have been a fashion show where one of the things that was displayed was Esther's pantsuit, her Pendleton pantsuit. And there may have been other items, maybe a picture or two. I honestly, I can't recollect now, but I was in charge of the displays, and I went on and on about her art. I fell in love with her art, and a very thoughtful person who was volunteering at the time sent out a thank you note to all of the volunteers who'd helped in that fashion show and luncheon. And something we don't do anymore, but the note card that she wrote to me was a small picture of a piece of art from Esther Webster that they somehow had made into note cards. And that was, I've never forgotten that. And, you know, there are still a few things floating out there that are not contained in either the archives of our programs or at the Arts Center. And there is one of, it's a wartime picture of women who tracked ships on a big scale, on a big board. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
filter board.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's still sitting in the Federal Building downtown.
Oh,
We replaced it with something called radar.
Yeah, but it's a wonderful picture.
but there was a time when women volunteers were doing that work.
No, it's
Yeah.
a big deal. It was important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it's an app on your phone, marine traffic.
Yeah.
What is it, Patrick? Marinetraffic.com.
Yep.
But it's a great picture. And then there was another one of, I guess actually I'm thinking incorrectly, because the note card had a picture of women sitting around a table and they all had big hats on, and she entitled it Club Ladies, I think, or Club Women, which was exactly what it looked like. Yeah. But I didn't know very much about Esther. I just heard a lot about her as the wonderful resident artist here. But gosh, what you talked about has made it so much better. Really, yeah. Everybody should listen to this talk. It would be very, very good.
Well, thank you. We did record it, so
Oh, you did.
if I
Nice.
can figure out how to get it online, we can share it for folks who didn't get a chance to be here. I should also mention, Amy and I are going to get back together again next weekend for the North Olympic Voices event, which is that Sunday at 2. Is that
Yeah.
right, Amy?
Yeah.
And so we're going to be focusing a little bit more, I think, on where Esther's story intersects with local history. Although it may involve us getting together and being like, what did we not get to talk about at ArtBites? Okay, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, it'll be a different conversation. There are no shortages of conversation when Sarah Jane and I start having them. But it'll be a different conversation. Next Sunday. I'll put the link in the chat.
Awesome. And I'll follow up with the folks that have already left, Amy, and share that link with them and just remind them that that's happening.
Okay.
So,
And that's free. North Olympic Voices talks are the update to, it's a History Tales update. If you're familiar with the History Tales talks that the History Center has been doing, they're free on the second Sunday of every month at 2 p.m. Same Zoom link every month. I'll put that in there now. I'm just opening my Zoom account to grab that link. But we will make sure it's a different conversation than this one. So we definitely invite you back.
yeah, it's definitely been hard. I mean, in the same way that it was difficult to curate down the art that got included in the exhibit from all of the art that we would have liked to show, it's also been hard to kind of curate down the stories. And so, and I'm really glad that we got some audience questions so that we got to direct that towards what y'all are interested in.
Mm-hmm.
If I shift into talking about terminal illness, is that something that this group would be comfortable with? And or if not, please feel free to get out of here. We are all dealing with plenty of trauma right now and do not need more. So
Comfortable, but we need to go. So we're going to miss
well,
it. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you,
Okay.
Beth. Thank you,
No
Janet.
problem. Thanks so much for being here and for your kind words. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Love it.
So as Amy and I mentioned, a number of things came kind of bubbling up as we were researching. And one of the really delightful connections that I got to make was meeting Lisa and Jerry Fagerland. And Jerry is the son of a couple who were very dear friends with Esther. He remembers visiting Esther a couple of times while she was still living, but it seems like it was really his parents' relationship. So his father, Gunnar Fagerland, had been a park ranger, was a photographer. All of the photographs of Esther that are in the show are Gunnar's photos. And Gunnar's wife, Frances Fagerland, was a poet, and she wrote a poem that this has not been officially published, but it has been informally published. So we certainly have the family's permission to be sharing this. But it's called Esther Wanting to Die. And it's a pretty poignant image of how Frances envisioned Esther facing the end of her life in what I perceive as the most Esther way. And so it was something that we felt was too tender, I think, to put in a public exhibit, but did want to share it with folks who were a little bit closer into her story. So I'm going to do a screen share of this poem. So Frances Fagerland is the poet. This was informally published in this Mind's Quiet Ponds kind of chat book that Frances had put together. So I'm not sure, although she gives the date on it as January of '85. Jerry Fagerland, her son, who shared this with us, was not sure whether this would have been written at that time or whether it would have been written at some time later on. I'm going to read this, and I need to apologize that I am not a poetry performer, but I will do my best. So this is titled Esther Wanting to Die. We were laughing on the phone. She said, "This is the second or third time I've lost track that the ambulance has come and taken me away." She said, "The driver must have been thinking it's the woman on Beaver Hill again. The nurses must have been leaning out of the windows complaining, 'Here comes that woman again.' The doctors, despairing, must have said, 'She's failed again.'" We laughed. Her lawyer had written, "Atta girl, keep trying." She said, "It has to be the medicine. The dose is enough. I'll make it yet if they don't put me in the rest home again, without pencils, crayons, or chalk." She said the whole thing was a circus, and we laughed. I said, "Why are we laughing?" "Why not?" she said. "It's better than crying. I did that in the hospital." She died in her sleep last night. Her courage 3 times tested. The pain in her breast had been worse. I can't operate my computer. The pain in her breast had been worse. Thank God she doesn't have to try again, I said, and think of her all the time. Jerry and Lisa Fagerland interpret that as a suicide. I find that the poem is fluid enough that I can read it that way, or I can simply read it as somebody who was ready at the time that death came for her. But I think it's a pretty intimate portrait from a friend who clearly knew her well. And as I think about, I'm talking to you from the room where Esther died. And so I have a sense of her presence here. And just thinking about somebody who at the end of her life, again, faced with a circumstance she didn't choose, and choices that were none of them what she would have wanted. But in founding the Art Center, and kind of, it's almost like she had the opportunity to tie up her own loose ends. And so that's been an important part of her story that Amy and I have been sitting with for a while. And it feels like I can't think of Esther's full story without that piece as well.
In her obituary that we received quite late in the process from our family researcher, it says Webster, who had been ill with cancer for some time, was found in her bed at 7:40 a.m. by Duncan McKiernan, a Port Angeles sculptor who was her secretary and longtime personal friend. And I'm sure many people recognize him as the late artist of the Cormorants statue at Hollywood Beach, among other pieces. That's probably one of his more Port Angeles famous pieces. Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted
I was going to say Duncan was also intimately involved in the planning of the Art Center and served as the first director for the Art Center. And so he really was a link between Esther's life and what she had wanted, and then what was able to happen after her passing.
It's interesting how many artists she was surrounded by, how her friend Frances, who writes a poem about her that way, and Duncan, who's so intimately involved in her life and death and legacy. And we've talked about the sort of irony, the way she arrived, and how in the end, she's the capstone Webster, as I call it, the last living Webster, as far as we can tell of that line. Charles and Esther did not have children, and the legacy was left to her to create, hence the title of the show in part.
Yeah. And the Art Center, interestingly, is dedicated to the memory of Charles Webster and Charles's father, E.B. Webster, but interestingly, not to Esther's mother-in-law, Jessie Webster. And so there's a little bit of pettiness, even at the end of her life there. I don't know how many people would have been bent out of shape by that late in time. I mean, none of these people were living at the point that the Art Center was opened, but it is like, ooh, she was prickly right up to the end.
The obituary says, in 1982, Webster said she wanted her home at 1203 East 8th Street. Interestingly,
this is why to this day a Google map will take you to the dead end of 8th Street instead of taking you to our current Lord's address.
Said she
Not
wanted
that I'm bitter.
to become a fine arts center. She appointed a board of trustees to work toward that goal. And she said it will be set up to be an outlet for the creative artists of our area, including, of course, painters, sculptors, weavers, and others in the craft arts, as well as poets, writers, and musicians, she said at the time.
Yeah, and in some of her writing about her vision for the Art Center, she really talks about how access to the arts impacts people's quality of life, and that she believes that every person could benefit from access to creative work and the opportunity to explore their own creativity. And so it really, this place is a gift to this community.
Truly.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that is like such a solid point to end on. that unless we have more questions, I'm inclined to leave it there, but I do want to hold space for questions or just conversation. Are we all feeling
Thank
pretty
you,
full?
Sarah Jane and Amy, for this.
Hmm.
I really appreciate the work you put into this and being further enlightened.
Hmm.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Jan.
I just wanted to say thank you also. What a wonderful presentation, Sarah Jane. And I did have a chance to visit the center to see the exhibit, and it's just beautifully curated. And both of you, Amy and Sarah Jane, you've done a wonderful job. So thank you.
Thank you,
Oh,
Christine.
thank you.
Here today.
You both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I want to say thank you too. And I was just thinking as you reflected all along on Esther's life and how she was a full participant in it. So it would not be so surprising to think that she might want to be a full participant in her dying. And somehow suicide doesn't capture that. We can be a handmaiden in our own life trajectory, or what the next step is, you know. And I don't necessarily think of that as suicide. I think of her just participating in who she was. But that was a very provocative presentation, and I'm glad you had the courage to dive into it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, and thanks for adding that framing on it. I agree that suicide feels like not quite the right word, and also I think that we lack good language to talk about some of this.
Yes.
But I appreciate that phrase, a full participant in her own life. I'm gonna, along with Diane's Arc of the World in the back of that painting, that I'm grabbing onto that line because I think that really, really captures what we understand about how she lived. Yeah.
And Sarah Jane informed me during the curating process that Esther did refuse treatment for her breast cancer. And she had, of course, suffered alongside Charles in years of poor health and had gone through a lot of misery and of course, you know, secondary to his. But she was much older by the time that came about.
That her diagnosis. Well, and I don't know what cancer treatment would have looked like in the late 70s. It sounds like she did research it. So she looked at what her options were and said no thanks. But yeah.
I was fascinated by that too, Cheryl. And I attributed in part her whether her obsession with story and sort of controlling that arc was part of what made her a good newspaper reporter and radio reporter, or if those skills were honed by those two occupations, I'm not sure. But she was definitely a person obsessed with story, and I may be projecting, and I can relate to that too. It was hard not to project or see it through our own lenses, but.
Well, she's such a strong, dynamic character, and you know, this is a long life. There's a lot of different parts of it to relate to. And I would be curious to see whether a different pair of curators might pull a completely different story out of this. It's like we can only show up with what we bring, and so yeah.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah.
It was just such a privilege to work on this with you, Sarah Jane. Thank you.
It has been pretty great. And fun to get together and share it with people. So shall we do this again next weekend?
Yes.
Sounds good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap the meeting up here. I will follow up with an email with that Zoom link to next weekend. But thanks so much for being here, and until next time.
Thank you.
Bye.